Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this event, to our first Upstate New York Regional Sociological Symposium. And thank you very much for coming to this event and just supporting us. My name is Elena Cherniak, and I'm one of the organizers of this symposium, along with Dr. Michael Branch and Dr. McKinney, Jack McKinney. Thank you guys also for helping us to do this. The goal of this symposium was to bring together scholars, students, and faculty from different colleges and universities come together and to talk about different social issues we are going through and we are observing and experiencing. And I think based on our programs, as you can see, we made it happen, and we are going to discuss with kind of such a great people these social issues. So again, thank you very much. And I hope you will enjoy this event, and we will have a couple of refreshments. After this session, we'll have refreshments. Yes, it will be many going up and down. Every kind of all food served on a third floor, and a few sessions will be in this room. So, and if you get lost, if you need assistance, please don't hesitate to ask our students who are also here. And I would like to pass the floor to Dr. McKinney, who will introduce our amazing speaker today.
Yes, it's echoing Elena. Thank you all so much for coming to the conference. It was our participants, of course, that have enabled us to make this happen, and we're very grateful to all of you all. It is a great honor to have the opportunity to introduce Bernice Pescosolido as our keynote speaker for our inaugural Sociology Symposium at Hartwick College. Dr. Pescosolido is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Indiana University. She is the founding director of the Indiana Consortium for Mental Health, and she is also the founding director of the brand new IRSE Institute that targets research in socio-medical sciences. Bernice's CV is 49 pages long. It's about the size of a manuscript itself. So if I've forgotten anything in curating this, Bernice, please feel free to tell our audience. She is an elected member of both the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. She is trained as a medical sociologist at Yale. Her research focuses broadly on how social networks and culture provide insight into health, illness, and healing phenomena, and more specifically 4 areas of sociological importance, looking at stigma, suicide, healthcare use, and healthcare systems. Her research on these topics has been published broadly across disciplinary and general journals, and it's been supported by a number of NIH institutes, as well as the National Science Foundation and private philanthropic organizations. I think I was trying to total up all of your grants. I think it's well over $6 million that you brought just to Indiana University alone, Bernice. She has also served as the vice president of the American Sociological Association, and she's received several career teaching and mentoring awards from, among other places, the American Public Health Association, the American Sociological Association, and Yale University. So Dr. Pescosolido's research is concerned with how social and organizational networks either facilitate or in many cases frustrate people's responses to health problems. So in the early 1990s, she developed the path-breaking network episode model. So this model shifted healthcare research away from simply analyzing whether or not people used healthcare services to actually understanding the patterns and pathways that would help them adhere to treatments. So in 1996, Pescosolido initiated the first major national study of stigma and mental illness in the United States, which produced the groundwork for the 1996 Surgeon General's report on mental health. This research would go on to inform the National Stigma Study on Children in 2006, the 2013 White House Conference on Mental Health, and the 2018 study of stigma in global context. Most recently, Dr. Pescosolido has led a 4-year effort to make college campuses safe and stigma-free zones for discussion and treatment of mental health issues. Dr. Pescosolido will be discussing a number of these topics today in her keynote address, from sociological science to social action, mental health, stigma, and student empowerment. Please join me in welcoming Bernice Pescosolido.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. I know that you were successfully awarded the Sorokin money from the American Sociological Association to do this, and I am honored that you selected me from really a range of phenomenal people who could have been here speaking to you. Upstairs, we were starting to talk about, a number of us were talking about our different experiences in graduate school and in our undergraduate days, and then as junior faculty members. And I wanted to bring that up because I specifically called this sociological science. And the reason I did that is that there are many debates in sociology that really should go away and die. And one of them is whether or not we're a science or not a science, right? For me, science just means that we use empirical data. And I don't care what kind of data it is. And of course, we've shown in many studies that having both kinds of data, qualitative, quantitative, now all this computational social science, the more data that we can bring in to answer our very important questions, I think that that's really important. The other reason I bring it up is because when I was a graduate student, there was a symposium much like this at Yale. And the two people who were there were at the time two of the most famous sociologists. And so there are some people of a certain age here, so they may remember these people. Daniel Bell, The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who wrote the Moynihan Report about Black poverty, and as far as I know, the only sociologist who then went and became a US Senator, right? And I was sitting there with a bunch of graduate students who were kind of on the radical side. And one of them, you know, there was a question and answer period. They gave their talk, and Kai Erikson had organized the talk about where is sociology going, what should we be doing, should we be engaging in public discourse? Because at the time, that was another one of those debates. Like, sociologists should just do their work. So one of my friends stood up and said, so where do you stand on sociologists contributing to public policy? Like, who should be doing it? When should we be doing it? And I remember so distinctly the two men went to a little corner and sort of discussed it, and then came out and said, sociologists' contribution to the public discourse should be from very few people, very sporadically. And what they meant was them. Right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about, like, start this off in terms of giving you a sense of my journey from being told, like, you do not talk to Oprah, you do not talk to the New York Times, you do not do any of this stuff, to the movement to public sociology and the idea that we have a responsibility to not only translate our knowledge to our students, but also to help society where possible. And this was a journey for me. This was not something that I necessarily came away from graduate school with. So I wanted just to give you a little bit of insight into the journey. Okay, so this is why I'm a sociologist. My interest was in understanding the human response to the onset of crisis, right? That's what I do. And in particular, I became interested in that crisis being health related, right? There are many crises that people face, but I became a medical sociologist. And these are the topics that Zach just told you about that I focus on. I focus on suicide, stigma, help seeking, which has a number of different terms that people use. Political scientists tend to say uptake of benefits. People in public health say help seeking. And if you're being theoretical in sociology, you talk about general decision-making processes, right? My focus in this really is on human connectedness and how we help each other or hurt each other in their struggles around crisis. Okay, and as Zach said, I developed this thing called the network episode model. And the reason that I did that was that I cut my teeth on those great utilization models. You've probably heard of some of them. Ron Anderson, sociologist, the health belief model. Rosenstock in psychology at Michigan, Azen and Fishbein on the theory of reasoned action, right? These were all the most popular models at the time, and at the time I was in graduate school, and this really dates me, I hate to say, but was the entrance of sort of multivariate modeling. And it was like, oh, we've got these great theories now, we can use, we can collect data, also the big national utilization studies were happening, and I was really excited about this. And so I did that for a couple of years, and then I started thinking, like, I don't know anybody who makes their decisions about healthcare that way. Because what is embedded in those models, right? It's an implicit rational choice, cost-benefit analysis. Like something happens to me, and I say, okay, actually, this did happen to me in a subway in New York. I was going from Indiana to New York to do a presentation, and I apparently scratched my finger on the wall at my house. By the time I got to the airport, my finger was purple. By the time I got to New York, my wrist was purple, right? So what did I do? Did I go, well, do I have health insurance? And how much does this worry me? And how much does this bother me? What did I do in the subways of New York? They still had payphones in the subways at that point. I called my mother in Rhode Island, and I said, Mom, what do you think? And she said, what is the matter with you? Go upstairs and find the first medical sign and go in. And lucky, I followed her advice. I actually had blood poisoning, and they gave me a shot. It was like this big, and I won't tell you where they gave me that shot, okay? And so I started thinking about how can we move from this idea that responding to crises is simply a decision as opposed to a socially embedded process, right? And so I developed this network model that took what, it didn't have to come from nowhere. Sociologists had already talked about social support to a large extent, right? They hadn't really done it in a network perspective before. It was mostly the Jim House, Deb Umberson kind of social support approach. So I kind of made it explicitly networked. And then I took from people like Irving Zola, and a lot of John Clausen, a lot of the qualitative sociologists who had followed people through their, John Jansen in anthropology, who had followed people at the onset of illness, and brought those two together, and then I didn't really want to study mental health, but National Institute of Mental Health came to me and said, we heard you have this new way of thinking about it. And I was, like everybody else in American society, I was like, I don't want to study people with mental health, mental illness problems. But I thought, okay, if I don't get a grant, I'm not going to get tenure at this point, so maybe I'll do it. Totally fell in love with studying mental health. Not that this model can't be applied elsewhere, but this is my home now. This is what I do. But the NIMH came back and said, well, we already know that networks affect healthcare utilization. This was my now second or third grant. And I said, because I was trying to say now that not only are there networks in the community, right, but there are also networks in the treatment system that matter, right? And boy, they did not like to hear that because their approach was a pill is a pill is a pill. Cognitive behavioral therapy is cognitive behavioral therapy is cognitive behavioral therapy. But I finally convinced them that we had to start thinking about multi-level processes. So this is what I was doing, and I did it for, maybe 2 decades, and I was able to show that networks matter, right? Big surprise to us, right, as sociologists. But I started thinking then, what is in those networks that matters, right? And as a classically trained sociologist, what did I think of? Stigma, right? So I started thinking about stigma, and I had went back and I read Goffman, and just a refresher, you remember that stigma is the mark. It makes people less than totally human. We now have done some really good work across all the social sciences and public health to show that there are different types, and it really matters what kind of stigma you're studying, and that we really need to understand that stigma is really just the mark. This is one of those words like love that everybody uses inappropriately, right? Stigma is really the mark, right? That trips into prejudice, which are negative, sometimes positive, attitudes, predispositions, and then what we really care about is discrimination. So one of the big arguments, again, one of those that should go in a corner and die is stigma a silly word, which was what the director of the National Institute of Mental Health told me at one point. And what he meant was he wanted us to change our language to stigma and discrimination, right? But if stigma is prejudice and discrimination, then we're saying prejudice, discrimination, discrimination. So people have taken various positions on this. I don't really care. You know, when I'm studying stigma and I'm studying attitudes, you know, I know what I'm studying, and when I'm studying discrimination, we've clarified. So a lot of that has been summarized in a piece that I did in the annual review with my husband, Jack Martin. Okay, so I started thinking, well, how can we embed understanding stigma into the network episode model? And it ended up taking me in a very different direction, which is I couldn't find anything in the literature on stigma at that point. There was a lot of studies, you know, if you remember, those of you who know labeling theory, right? Tom Sheff saying there's no such thing as mental illness, and then Walter Gove saying it's not the label, it's the behavior. And sociologists were doing this fighting with one another. It's the label, it's the behavior, it's the label. But they had stopped studying what people in the real world were actually thinking. The landmark study was done in 1950 by Shirley Starr. It's one of the most famous unpublished manuscripts that exists. In fact, I have one of the final copies. And again, those of you who remember the purple mimeo, it's a purple mimeoed, you know, set of pages, right? And so I started thinking there must be, you know, and there were a lot of studies at that time. Cummings and Cummings did a study. There was a study of Louisville, Kentucky. There were a number of studies of stigma. But then in sociology, we went to this debate about labeling theory, not labeling theory, and kind of forgot about stigma. And I thought to myself, well, I must be wrong, right? And so I called Bruce Link. And Bruce Link was one of the people at Columbia who was carrying on the stigma tradition. And I said to him, Bruce, where are the studies of stigma that followed the Shirley Starr thing? He said, never happened. It's never happened. And I said, well, we have to change that. So Bruce and I linked arms, and nobody wanted to study stigma. Like we went to NIMH. They were like, we don't care because we know stigma exists. We just want you to send us a randomized clinical trial of how to reduce it in individuals. And I'm like, not interested. Then the American Psychiatric Association, the president in 2004 said, with deinstitutionalization, right, the shift from asylum care to community care, which never really got funded, stigma has dissipated in the United States. And as a sociologist, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had just spent 9 months in the 2 largest psychiatric hospital units in Indianapolis, like doing the network episode model study, right? And I was like, I didn't see that stigma had dissipated. Not only were there comments in the unit, but as these people, especially in the public charity hospital, left, there were people waiting for them. Pimps, people who were selling drugs, abusive partners were waiting for them to get out of the unit. So I was like, no, wait a minute. So finally, Bruce and I convinced the MacArthur Foundation to let us do a national study. And that was the first battle, right? So we got the money that it took to add a module to the General Social Survey, which many of you know, the longest running monitor of Americans' attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, started by Jim Davis, and first one was in 1972. They did them every year until about the 1980s, when they started to become so expensive, they did them every other year. And they had always had a program, again, starting in the 80s, where, you know, the beauty of the GSS is that we have this incredible time series on American culture, right? But people started saying, yeah, but what else? So they came up with this idea of having modules. And groups could get together and submit a module to the overseers board, who would vet it scientifically. There were only room for 4 on each fielding of the GSS. And we were able to get the scientific board to say, this is important, we should do this, because it wasn't the first national study, it was the first study since 1950, right? So there'd been a 40-year gap in our understanding of the national cultural climate toward people with mental health and addiction in the United States. But then, once we got scientific approval, then the people who actually do the GSS, NORC, right, National Opinion Resource Center, they were like, we don't want to do vignettes, right? And why did we sort of push that we wanted to do vignettes? Well, mostly stigma research said things like, would you sit next to a bus on a person with mental illness, right? Well, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about the kid with ADHD? Are you thinking about the homeless person with psychotic symptoms? Are you thinking about a depressed woman? Like, we had no idea what the referent was. Okay? That was the first scientific reason that we wanted to do vignettes. The second was that mental health literacy, as defined by Tony Jorm, was knowing what mental illness is and knowing what to do about it, right? When you already have the term mental illness embedded in a scientific question, you can never get at problem recognition. Like, are people not going because they don't see it as a problem? Right? So we finally convinced them. And the reason they didn't want to do it is that Peter Rossi at University of Massachusetts had done vignettes on crime in the 70s, and nobody ever used those data. And they were like, nobody's going to use this. This is expensive, retail landscape. This costs a lot to do this survey. But we sort of beat them down, essentially. We're just like, we have to do it this way. So for me, what happened was stigma moved from something that I wanted to embed into the network episode model to a central focus, became a fundamental. I wanted to ask macro questions, but I started thinking that if we are going to think about how to help the world, we need to find out how we can bust the myths that people have. Well, in order to do that, you have to know what the myths are, right? Okay, and then I started thinking much later in my career, like maybe it's not just the science that I should be doing, okay? So to date, we have done 4 stigma studies with the GSS that we call the National Stigma Studies. This, you can take your time at some point to look at those. You'll have the slides, right, available to you. But I'm just going to tell you the major messages of each of the ones that we did. Okay, the first one was that in the United States in 1996, about 50% of Americans expressed stigma towards some group or some venue, right? So stigma was not dead. Okay, there was a big difference by mental illness, right? And people, again, up to this point, we're sort of using the generic category. Turns out that there's a huge difference between depression, which was the lowest, schizophrenia, which was second, right? Surprisingly. A big jump, though, between depression and schizophrenia. But what Americans really don't like are people who use substances. Right, so the highest stigma is actually toward people with alcohol. We had substance use disorder and alcohol abuse, right? So the way that we did the vignettes, like sociologists should not just be making up vignettes. We made them up, then we gave them to, Bruce took them to, the New York State Psychiatric Institute and had the psychiatrists write vignettes that would match the DSM, right? Evil thing that it is, right? The DSM. Then, of course, they were written like they were for the MCAT, right? Totally useless. So then we gave them to my husband, who was not my husband at the time, but was a survey researcher at University of Georgia. He rewrote them for the public, and those are the ones that we used. Okay. The other thing that we saw was that the more intimate the venue on the classic, so what people were using in stigma research was a translation of Bogartis's social distance measure tailored to mental illness. So, would you interact with this person as your neighbor, as your friend, on the job, work closely on the job, have them marry into your family, right? The more intimate, the higher the level of stigma. Okay, and we did see a lot of increased public sophistication where we could compare it to the original Shirley Starr data. We went up to the University of Chicago, who still had the original surveys. And we got into the dusty room, and there wasn't a lot that we could compare directly because in 1950, which is when the study was done, 55 was the Mimeo, that they were talking about psychosis and neurosis, right? So it wasn't exactly the same, but we did have some places where we could compare. So then we started thinking about kids. Okay, well, this was the point at which George Will was saying in the Washington Post, there's no such thing as ADHD. It's just that Americans do not tolerate kids with problems, right? So what we did was we did a study of adults, but looking at kids' problems. Overall, the levels toward child mental health problems are lower, which is kind of a good thing. Still, big difference by mental illness. And guess what, George Will? The public can differentiate between a person that we call the normal child, which was written by a psychiatrist who was the chief federal psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health at that point. We had him write, because we were like, are there any normal kids? He goes, I can write you a normal child vignette, right? So we had the normal child vignette, and Americans can differentiate between daily problems and ADHD. So put it there, right? And then the same intimacy spectrum. You know, it's okay if they're in their classroom. It might be okay if they play with them on the play yard, but they don't want them to be friends, right, with kids with those with different kinds of problems, okay? This was actually funded, this is where I took my first hit as a sociologist from my colleagues. This was actually funded by Eli Lilly and Company, all right, not the foundation, the Lilly Foundation, which mostly funds religion and philanthropy studies, but funded by the, you know, I live in the land of Eli Lilly, right? And we had some Prozac questions on there, and the scientific board was very excited about it, but they were like, are we going to be sued by Eli Lilly? So that's how I got the funding. I called them and I said, if we have this on the General Social Survey, are you going to sue us? And they said, no, sue you, we'll fund you, right? Why? Why? Well, Prozac was going off patent. So they didn't care. They could have cared less about that. But anyway, I gave a presentation at the American Public Health Association and got skewered, you know, that I took like evil pharma money. Yeah, I don't care, right? Okay. Then this next one was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, where we were able to show that there were significant changes in Americans' understandings of mental illness, but no change in stigma. And your knowledge did not relate to your stigmatizing attitudes either. The reason that that was important was at the time, the major anti-stigma programs were all focused on one tagline. And that tagline was a disease like any other. If we can convince people that mental illness is just like diabetes, right? In fact, there was a bulletin board I was asked to vet for, I'll tell you, an organization that I now work with. They wanted to put up a bulletin board that said, you know, would you be blamed if you had cancer? Well, can you think of cancers that you get blamed for? Right? Lung cancer, anal cancer, right? Probably any cancer if you don't look like you're, you know, an Olympic marathon runner, right? So it was like, no, this is not good. So anyway, I think the impact that we had at that point was because of the Surgeon General's report and because of where that had gone, that we actually started to see some movement in how people were doing anti-stigma work, okay? Then in 2018, we were funded by the National Science Foundation to do this last one. And what was really exciting here is for the first time in doing this, we see a drop in stigma, and it's toward depression, right? But not everything's going the way we want. There's an increase in, like, the schizophrenia vignette elicited even more people saying that person was likely to be dangerous now than it was in all the other studies. And there was a slide back on addictions. And I was giving a talk to a public group, an alumni group at Indiana, and I said, yeah, it looks like more people now in the United States are saying that alcohol abuse is a result of bad character. And I was saying that as sort of some kind of, you know, liberal, blah, blah, blah. And this guy stands up and says, well, it's about time. I was like, okay, well, I'll move on, okay? The other thing that we see is that this change is really the result of the millennials, right? And other young people. Remember this, at this stage, we're only talking about the millennials because, you know, the GSS doesn't interview teens. They only interview people, I think, 18 and older. Now, so the other thing that we see because of that is that there's a conservatizing effect of age, right? So as people get older, or older people are more likely to endure stigma. Now, I would get really excited about that, but as a medical sociologist, I remember this really important book by Marie Haug that was about challenging medical authority. And she found that young people are more likely to challenge the authority of physicians, meaning at that time it meant like actually ask them questions, right? But we see no change over time. So we actually don't know if the millennials are going to, and the Gen Zers are actually going to continue this, or whether or not they will become more conservative as they age as well, which is why we really need to think about that in terms of anti-stigma efforts, right? We also did some international work. The first global study, not the first cross-national study, that was done by the European Union. But what interested me in this was Arthur Kleinman is probably the most important medical anthropologist of his generation, right? I pair him with like David Mechanic in sociology, people who were really impacting not only theory but real world change. And Arthur Kleinman had said that the single most important finding that we see from the international study of schizophrenia was that the data documented that people got better in Nigeria and India than in the US and UK, right? And so the question was, well, why was that, right? Now, the people who did that study did not say it was stigma, but if you look at any psychiatry textbook, if they ever have any social finding, it's this finding, and then they always start talking about stigma. And again, what does that say? It says that people in India and Nigeria are nicer to people with mental illness than people in the United States and Great Britain. And I thought to myself, again, the hairs on the back of my neck kind of stood up. I was like, that doesn't sound right. So we got the funding to do this study, and we were looking at, we looked at correlations between, I don't know, God bless the political scientists and economists who have come up with like 20 different measures of development, right? Gross national product, like there's just endless, we did them all, right? And we correlated that with, we had 7 different scales of stigma, 27 different measures. So we correlated that, right? And here's the finding. Not one correlation supported that idea, right? That was not a mistake by the WHO study of schizophrenia, but every interpretation that the mechanism that underlied that was stigma. There were some that did not support, and there were actually correlations that said, actually, the highest levels of stigma in our study were in the Philippines, South Korea, Cyprus, and Bangladesh, okay? Now, there's some interesting analyses that we're doing right now that suggest that maybe people in developed countries are more stigmatizing toward mental illness in particular, right? And that people in the global south are more concerned with anybody who has illness, right? So, because we had a control of, which turned out to be a terrible control, we controlled for asthma. Because we wanted to control for the troubled person, but our Spanish and British partners would not have a troubled person vignette in the study. They just said, we're not doing it if you include this, because we are not going to waste the time of our citizens answering a survey about a non-problem. Like, they didn't understand the concept of an anchoring vignette. And these were like the most accomplished survey researchers in the world, but they still didn't like this. So we debated between asthma and diabetes. We all met in Madrid in 2004 and debated this, and we picked asthma. Turns out, terrible decision, because I think in the global south that was interpreted as tuberculosis. So, like, everybody makes lots of mistakes. So here we go. Okay, so where are we now, right? And how did then, this change what I was doing? Okay, well, here's from 1996, and this wasn't because of us, and I don't know what happened, but it turned out from about the mid-90s, there was a resurgence in study of stigma. Not in the United States alone, but Matthias Engemeyer and Georg Chernomis in Germany, Graham Thornycroft and the King's College in London started major studies there. They're the ones who did the European Union studies. I don't know why. Like, if there's a sociologist of knowledge who can explain this, we were part of it, but we have no responsibility or no credit But there was this big resurgence. So what did the resurgence tell us? Well, we had really good data now that showed in contemporary society, stigma really translates into denial opportunities, into isolation, and into life expectancy. The Denmark studies showing that people with schizophrenia have a 7 to 12-year life expectancy loss. In the United States, if you are treated in the public system, it can be up to 25-year loss of life expectancy. So really good data on this. It's implicated in people not recognizing problems, not seeking help. There are limited, this translates to the organizational side where, the services available to somebody who has cancer versus somebody who has mental health problems is just dramatically different. And then at the college level, this is sort of like the last aspect of non-retention, right, that we can look at. And I'll talk about that again in a minute. Okay, it carries over so that it turns out that this results in people not going into mental health treatment. I teach a course called Medicine in America, which is a freshman level course. A lot of pre-meds in there, and a lot of them come up to me and say, I want to be a psychiatrist, and my parents said, absolutely not, right? So that's how it translates there. It also translates into, geographical and financial access to care. Again, the opportunities to seek treatment for cancer versus mental health are just different. During the pandemic, we saw that 70% of emergency room physicians said that they were having active mental health problems, and 70% of them said that they would not talk to their colleagues about it because they were afraid that their colleagues would stigmatize them. And then of those 70%, almost 50% said it will jeopardize my licensing, right? Because there's only 22 states remaining in the United States where you have to acknowledge if you ever had a mental health problem or were hospitalized overnight for a mental health problem. It has nothing to do with your ability to practice medicine. Anyway, okay, so we now know that it's not just mental health. There are other conditions that are stigmatized. Sometimes we just call them prejudice, right? We know about intersectionality now, so we know that it's very complicated. We know it's very persistent and pernicious, but we have seen some little evidence now that we can change it, right? And that we need new approaches because all those randomized clinical trials that the NIH funded, they showed dramatic effects right after the intervention, and by 6 weeks later or 2 months later, people were at their same levels of stigma again, right? So we have to have new approaches, and media campaigns, which has been sort of the mainstay of anti-stigma work, nobody ever measures their impact. So we've got to rethink how we do this, okay? Then this happens, right? I get a phone call in my office one day, and I pick up the phone, and I hear, hi, is this Professor Pescosolido? And I'm like, yes. And she says, this is Glenn Close. And I'm like, okay, so for some of you youngins, like Glenn Close was in a very famous movie called Fatal Attraction. She was the original Cruella de Vil. She was in Dangerous Liaison. She's in Guardians of the Galaxy. She's Nova Prime Real. But anyway, she's a fantastic actress, right? She calls me, so she says, I said, so I thought it was like one of these two characters. These are two of my friends from graduate school. One at University of Toronto, one at Rutgers. And I'm like, stop punking me, this isn't funny. And she goes, no, I just read your article in the American Journal of Psychiatry, this one, and I said, I know, it's mainstay reading for Glenn Close, right? And she says, no, it is. And she said that she has been going to lots of galas, and she's now sort of fed up with going to galas and writing checks because her sister at 50 years old came to her and said, Glennie, I can't stop thinking about killing myself. And they always thought she was the wild child in their family, but it turns out she has bipolar disorder. And even more importantly, her son, Kalen Pick, has schizoaffective disorder. So Glenn says, I want to start an organization called Bring Change to Mind. And I'm thinking, oh God, here we go. They're going to want to do, PSAs, right? And she said, here's my tagline. And I'm like, wow, that's a different tagline than a disease like any other, which was the main one. So we talked about it, and I agreed, and I still am the chair of her scientific advisory board, because she wanted it to stand on two legs: family, which is why she got into it, and science, because she wants it to work, right? So this was one of those moments in my career where I was like, well, yeah, I kind of want to hang out with Glenn Close, right? But it's like, I don't know, what's she going to make me do? You know, and I can hear my advisor in the background, if I ever see you on Oprah, you know. So, but it was one of those moments in your career where I said to myself, okay, are you going to put up or shut up, right? So I said, okay, I got to do this, right? Very nervously I said that, right? So then this happens, right? We start seeing research on relatively new facts about the rising suicide rates in youth, right? And 10 years ago, at least 10 years ago, Steve Hinshaw at Berkeley predicted the rise in female teen suicide, which he called the triple bind. When I was in high school, you could be like the smart girl, the cheerleader girl, you could be, you could be the drama geek, right? You had a role, right? Now, girls in high school are expected to be all of those things. And as Steve shows in the book, also sexy, like, ouch, right? So he called this the triple bind, and we're starting to see it play out. We also see that there's earlier recognition and diagnosis of mental health issues, which is a good thing, but then we also have now understood adverse childhood experiences and the long arm that it has, right? So we see this new problem that was probably always there, but now recognized and documented by science. And then we started seeing, you know, we already knew that there were issues for kids who come to especially a residential college like this, right? They get new living arrangements, new networks, new expectations. We know that the college years bracket the major years of onset. Like, we don't know why. We think it might have something to do with puberty. You know, there's a theory about schizophrenia during puberty. Like, when you're a baby to when you go through puberty, your brain just makes more and more neurons. But then when you go through puberty, your brain actually goes through and prunes the neurons, and that maybe schizophrenia is about an over-pruning at that point. But for whatever reason, we see that as the major age of onset. Dan Eisenberg, who was at Michigan, who's now at UCLA, started doing the Project Healthy Mind, showing that prevalence, 30%, right? When I started doing this work at IU and sort of bringing it to the administration, they were very supportive, but there were some people in the background saying, do we really want to be known as the college who attracts the mentals? And I was like, okay, like, we got a lot of work to do, you know, and it wasn't IU, it's everywhere, right? But the administration really stepped up. But a lot of administrators were trying to debate what to do about this, right? And the reason it's important, as I said, it's the last mutable aspect of non-retention. And we now know, because of the students who have come out and said they had mental health problems, they are among our most successful graduates, right? So 30% of college students experience mental health problems during their college years. Some of them were dropping out, some of them were very successful. We were doing nothing for them, okay? And so we have this, you know, lost productivity of past generations, and we really need to deal with that now, because retention became, you know, in the 90s became the issue of college administrators, right? And no college or university is going to ever be able to provide the amount of services that are needed by the college population. One, because it's 30%. The other is because it's cyclical. So even if you had enough people at a college to, you know, provide services for 30% of your population, during midterms and finals, where does that go, right? Through the roof, okay? So we have to think of something else, right? And then, you know, we have this, colleges and universities cannot be expected to solve a national problem, right? This is not just a problem in colleges, it's a problem everywhere. So what do? Well, I started looking into the sociological research, public health research, and sort of came up with this list of things that really could help us understand what we might do in terms of creating an evidence base for change, right? And one of those things suggested, and there was a report that came out of the National Academies of Medicine in 2016, that is, we now call it the Stigma Report, that sort of, I did a lot of that work, did a lot of work with the people on that committee, and we sort of came up with this kind of approach, which is, if you're going to get rid of stigma, it has to be a long-term effort. It can't be a randomized clinical trial that is not scalable, right? And so we started thinking about the research on cohort replacement, which is a much longer way of thinking about reducing stigma. It might not be satisfying to some people, but where did that theory come from? It came from an article in the American Journal of Sociology by Paul Burstein and Bill Freudenberg, right? And what were they studying? They were studying the Vietnam War. Why did we get out of the war, right? And everybody's like, oh, it was the student protests. Well, indirectly it was the student protests, but if you look at their study, you see that what happened was the American population voted out the hawks and voted in the doves. That's cohort replacement. So we have to start thinking about cohort replacement. You know, we're not going to go out and replace people in American society, but it does target where you might do the change, and I'll get to that in a minute. The other thing is this, these two people in business schools came up with this idea of wicked problems, right? And, you know, think about it like the whack-a-mole game, right? If you just address public stigma, that's cruel because if you just address self-stigma, that's cruel. You try to get somebody to understand that they're valuable, that they can do what they want, given their illness, right? That's the definition of recovery, but then you send them out into a cruel world, right? So you push this down, this might push up, right? So we have to think about it like some way to do the whack-a-moles where we might get not as big a change in one area, but a better change across the board. We need to think about multiple levels from the target population to sectors and institutions, right? There are policies embedded in institutions that specifically deny the rights of people with mental health problems. And then it has to be high touch, right? So I'll give you an example of a really great program that doesn't have as much impact as it should, and that is Active Minds. Do you all have an Active Minds thing here? No? Okay, so Active Minds is a club-based model that came out of University of Pennsylvania when one of the students there took his life. And the parents created this Active Minds. You can get it online. They have lots of things you can do. They have this thing called Post Secret, which we've actually used, where you have an event where students write down anonymously their secrets. They send them in. Then there's like a reception or something where all these secrets are posted and people discuss them, and nobody acknowledges who wrote what. And it sort of allows you to start talking about these things in the open. All right? The problem with that, to me, is that what happens in colleges seems to be that there are a bunch of students who are really excited about mental health. They find an advisor. And I got to say, faculty are not the best advisors on this because we're gypsies too. We move. I mean, hopefully you all graduate, right? You graduate. So what happens after 3 or 4 years? The club is really active for 2 or 3 years. Then they graduate. Then you're back to square one, okay? So in order for a college effort to work, it's got to have buy-in by the institution. And it's got to have somebody who actually can be a stabilizing and sustainable advisor for them, okay? So that's what we call high touch, okay? So you have to target individuals when they are open to change, okay? Sociology recently, not that recently, but for me it seems recent, the acquired disposition model, Steve Vasey and Omar Lizardo, talking about how people are really only open to changing their embedded beliefs at certain periods in their life, okay? One of those periods is when they go to college, right? And what some very old research said in the ASR was the first 6 weeks. That's why I teach freshmen, because I got 6 weeks to like put them on the right road. After that, they're just too cool for us. So anyway, and the other thing from political science, Charles Lindblom's idea is that, American policy tends to be only crisis responsive. Like we don't have like rational policy. There's a crisis, we try to do something, right? He called that muddling through, right? That's American policy. Okay, and then, we have to start thinking about a mechanism that is at the root of stigma, not just the superficial. Go back to Goffman, right? Stigma is an attribute known to others, but effects materialize only in social interaction, social relationships, social networks, okay? And then from the communities out there, they started using this phrase, nothing about us without us. Absolutely right. Grassroots ownership is important, local buy-in for the direction and for leading. And then not an inoculation, but you have to weave this into the social fabric. Okay, where did that come from? Kathleen Blee's book, Women of the Klan. All right, so it doesn't have to be mental health research. All right, so Kathleen Blee was an undergraduate at Indiana University. She then went to University of Wisconsin and did her PhD on why the Klan was so powerful in Indiana. And we're so proud, right? And it turned out that the reason, it's not like people in Indiana are bad. In fact, the thing that freaked me out when I moved there from the East Coast is that everybody says hello to you. And I was like, what do you want? You know, it was like typical, you know, East Coast response. They'd be like, hi. I'd be like, what do you want? You know? So, but it turned out what they did was they didn't say who they were. They infiltrated the Grange. And every farmer in Indiana, which is one of the basic agricultural states of this nation, everybody belonged to the Grange. Once they infiltrated the Grange, then they started talking about white womanhood, right? And so Indiana came on, right, because of that. How did Indiana get out of the Klan, we hope, is that the women then stood up and said, you know, wait a minute, like this is supposed to be about protecting your white women, but on Friday nights, like you're going out and shooting up the town and getting drunk and doing really bad things. And the women said, you're staying home, right? So that book really gave you, I always say, and this I think upsets people, but if you want to know how to do behavioral change, look at the people who do evil than the people who do good, because for some reason they're much more effective, right? So take the lessons from the Klan and from the Klan book, and we have to infiltrate the entire social fabric, right? Okay, so how do we do that? Well, how did we translate that into social action, and then how did that move forward? Well, okay, so Bring Change to Mind is the name of Glenn Close's organization. After trying to convince her, they still do PSAs, but we convinced her, you know, that she should start young, right, infiltrate, and they have two programs. One program is a high school program, which is a high-touch program. It's in about 400 high schools right now, and they're expanding. They're limited by, it's all nonprofit, all donations, so they're limited by that, but they're already in 400 high schools. And then we came up with this idea of the university version of Bring Change to Mind, which isn't exactly the high school version, but the idea was to make college campuses safe and stigma-free zones. Right? Sociologists have no business providing services. Not that we can't help make the provision of those services better, right? But this is not to provide services or even get people into services, because then you're jerking them around. You're telling them they need to go into services that don't exist or that they can't afford, right? So the idea of this is to really create on the campus a culture of acceptance and inclusion, right? And, you know, difference recognized and difference devalued is stigma. And one of the things that we decided right from the beginning was, yes, this would be a mental health anti-stigma organization, but we would, from the beginning, understand the notion of intersectionality, and that not all sizes fit together in terms of the kinds of things that you do. Okay, that we would try to address the triggers of mental health problems and solution, which is stigma, and this is supposed to be not just non-neurotypicality, but also problems that lead to mental health problems that college students face, like social isolation, stress, difference, right? All of those things were things that this club sort of addresses to try to make the climate at IU better. Okay, and then leverage peer-to-peer. Nothing about us without us, right? First of all, since the millennials, they're more aware of and accepting of mental health issues. They're more oriented toward doing. You know, I've been at IU long enough that I went through the people who were, the students who were apathetic, to the 90s when greed was good and they were all going to be millionaires. Then to breath of fresh air, the millennials, and following from that, like we can change the world. Right? So they're more oriented toward doing and social activism, and also they're more, tied to being alone together, right? You see them in groups, but they're all like this, right? So we had a number of challenges, we had a number of things that we needed to do. So we did the national pilot at IU Bloomington, and it had two parts. One was led by the students, right? And we had an advisor that was paid for, right? And they did the program with our help, because the first year it actually was a miserable failure, and then we restarted in 2015 and followed the 2015 cohort for 4 years. That was called the College Toolbox Project, and we built a model. We built an analytic model to establish whether or not it was working. And it was built on 5 principles also from scientific research, okay? The first one is start young. Get in there at orientation, right? Let them know from the beginning that we want to see them when they start to have struggles. You know, we need to help them when they have struggles. So what do? Do we lecture them? Like, not what entering freshmen want to have, right? We have a thing called Welcome Week. Things are all decided by the students, which has landed me in the provost's office more than once, but I really don't care. This is one that did land me in the provost's office. They came up with these really high quality tattoos that say, "Stigma can suck my popsicle." Okay, not my choice, not what I would have done, but it's very hot in Indiana during orientation. So you get the kids in, giving them the popsicles, because everybody wants popsicles because it's hot, and they love tattoos. And for 2 weeks, these are so high quality, they last for about 2 weeks. We have living bulletin boards, right? Whether or not they care about the issue, they wanted the tattoo. Cool idea. So start young, okay? Second, by students for students, right? This was something else the students did that I landed in the provost's office for. Okay, this is our bus. You know, we have a bus that goes through campus, and they started doing these bus wraps. And so the students came up with a bus wrap that came out of something that was on the internet at the time. And you would put your name in, and there was this little stick figure, and then it would tell a story. But the students made up their own story, right? This is Richard. Richard tells his friend to just snap out of it when she's depressed. Richard doesn't know that this is stigmatizing. Don't be a Richard, right? You bring change to mind. And the other side had information about contact, right? Now, you can imagine when the students did this, this was not the end of the tagline. It was the nickname, okay? And the provost calls me and she says, "Bernice, I can't have a bus going through not only campus, but the town of Bloomington, where 5-year-olds are asking their mom, what is a..." And I was like, okay, I got it, I get it. And so I said, but I don't want to go back to the students and say, so the provost was a friend of mine. We started talking about it and like how funny it was, and it was really funny and blah, blah, blah. And then she came up with this. She came up with, why don't you just say, "Don't be Richard"? So I was like, that sounds good. I said, I'll take it back to the students. And the students' reaction was the following. So it's even better because we'll get it, but you guys will never get it. And we're like, yeah, no, we don't get it. Okay. Now, the provost did receive one call from a woman whose husband was named Richard and felt that we were stigmatizing Richards. Fortunately, the provost knew this person and kind of talked her down, I guess, okay? Bait and flip, right? If you do a lecture on mental health, who's going to come to the lecture? Kids who already care about mental health, faculty who already care, you know, everybody who already cares about mental health, all the advisors would come. You want to get the people, we know from research that those people already have lower levels of stigma, right? We got to get the people outside the choir. How do you get them? You bait and flip. Now notice that's not bait and switch, that's illegal, right? But bait and flip is you do something that college kids want to go to, and then you sort of sneak in the mental health messaging, right? And the inclusion and acceptance messaging. So this Bring in the Booty was actually something that in my class now, what I do is their last assignment is to come up with an anti-stigma activity based on science that maybe the club could use, right? And so this one group came up with Bring in the Booty. Every part of the scavenger hunt had a clue that had to do with mental health and understanding and learning. And then the first people who did it, the first group, and we had 20 groups sign up, 20 groups of 5 sign up. And it also happened to be in October, so we had an additional like costume prize thing. So these were, and again, some of you might get this, these are Fairly Odd Parents wanting to bring in the booty, right? So we've got the pirates and the fairies from Fairly Odd Parents. So anyway, they won. And the other one that won was actually my favorite. It was 5 students. One was dressed in a white lab coat, and the other 3 were dressed in animal ones. But what they had done with the animal costumes was they switched the heads. So like the alligator had a tiger head, you know, because it was a scientist who was doing weird stuff, right? That one too. So those won, and they do this almost every year now because it's so popular. Then some of the club teams, you know, convinced them, you know, the teammates convinced them that let's do this, and you know, we get them the shirts. We get them the swag that they need. This was particularly against University of Illinois, and the students on the club team actually convinced the University of Illinois team to do it as well. So both sides one had white with green, the other one had green with white, because green is the color of mental health. So bait and flip, you have to come up with things that students want to go to and then, right? And you know, everybody who's been in a college knows that students love food and puppies, but they can no longer do food and puppies because it's overworked. Every group now does food and puppies. So they have to come up with something very creative. Okay, the other thing is to leverage and celebrate uniqueness, but measure impact. This was, again, a student assignment that remember, these are freshmen, okay? First year students. Not supposed to call them freshmen anymore. Anyway, so this was one, sorry, stigma, the stage has no room, right? And what they did was you would come to this and they were going to teach you how to Bollywood dance, and then you'd have Indian food. I mean, that's such a winner. We had so many people sign up for that, we had to cut it off. And then they provided that information, they talked a little bit about it, and importantly, this is the learning component of this, is that we teach the students how to do basic, not, you know, publication level, but basic ways to evaluate events, okay? And so they learn as they're doing this as well in terms of a little bit of social science. And we take that information, the students have to fill out these forms as they're doing this, that has the cost and the science that it's based on, and you know, how do you do it, and then the evaluation results. And we turn those into these little brochures, which we have about over a dozen of these now, different things that we do. Movies and mental health, one of the things that we did that was also very popular, the students did, they wanted to address, remember when that TV show came out, 13 Reasons Why, and all parents were like, everybody was like, oh, we can't let them see this. And the students were, you know, some students were like, yeah, some students were like, no. So we said, let's have a dinner, right? They came to us and said, we want to do a dinner, like in this thing called the Frangipani Room in the Union. Can we have a dinner and have a panel talk to us about suicide and about their opinion on 13 Reasons Why? And then can we have a big discussion, right? And have dinner. We had 150 people sign up. We could only put in 100. But that was one of these as well. So we have all of these things available. And that not only is a library, but it's a living library. So that whenever groups do this, whenever there's a new event, we make one of these brochures, and then the students' names and their university is on the back of it. So one of the things I learned about the millennials is that they use a word that none of us used when we were in college, which was they want to leave a legacy. And I'm like, okay, I just wanted to get out of college, you know. It's like, but anyway, so we want people to have ownership of this. So that's sort of where we are. Okay, we did mark. We did an internet survey. If you know, colleges and people send out internet surveys. The average response rate for an internet survey to a college or university is about 9%. Okay, the students worked really hard. We worked really hard. We got half. We got about 4,000 of the entering freshmen to do this survey. There was a swag bag, which was also a learning experience about what we wanted to put in it, you know, pens and Post-it notes. And they were like, no, we want fanny packs. And I was like, and we want tank tops. And I was thinking, nobody in my generation would be caught dead with a fanny pack or a tank top. And they didn't want any tank top. They wanted a Comfort Colors tank top. Right? And this is where it's important to be linked to people in the real world, because they cost like $7 without the printing, right? This was wholesale, right? And that's what they found out. So we're at a meeting, Glenn had come to IU, and we're sitting there telling her this, and she goes, who owns this company, right? She gets her phone, bing, 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 bing. She, hi, this is Glenn Close. We would like to use these. So we got them for $2 each, right? And she has lots of connections. And many people in the mental health space really have lots of connections now. So, you know, trying to build this as a national thing is really important. So when I first looked at these numbers, I kind of panicked, because this is much lower than you see in the population. And I'm thinking, we're not going to be able to change this. They're already, you know, so much better than where the adults are. But in fact, we did this over 3.5 years, and we found that across all measures, stigma was lower at T2, general prejudice decreased, college-specific prejudice decreased, things that were about IU or their roommates. College-specific social distance decreased, and importantly, we saw some behavioral change, that said that people now were reporting that more people in their social networks, right, that had mental illness. That didn't mean, did they go out and grab somebody and say, oh, I want you in my network because then I can report it? No, it meant that disclosure was happening, right? Discussion was happening. Okay. So this shows that it was the effect of the program, because in fact the number of events that they attended was directly related to the decrease, right? And you know, my provost, that same provost, my friend, when I said to her, well, can we now institutionalize this at IU and think about where else we might want to do it? She was like, I'm not doing anything till you show me the science. I was like, okay, like the best thing you can do if you want me to do something is tell me I can't do it. Yeah. So this is the best journal in child and adolescent psychiatry in the country, if not the world. I brought her this publication and smacked it on her desk and said, there's the science. Then she retired. Okay. So then COVID happens. I got 5 minutes, so I can't go into this, but you all know what happened during COVID. It just, you know, like all the sociological research on disasters had shown, it just made visible the fault lines in society. And it was the Matthew effect in retrograde, right? People who were worse off got worse off, right? But it was also a mental health moment, right? All of a sudden we realized that mental health was important, that there was what sociologists called a moment of emotional identification, and that, you know, mental health was really important for life, and that it gave us our opportunity to sort of revise our conception of mental illness, right? Okay. Then the provost retires, the president retires, we get new leadership. She comes in and she says, mental health, student mental health is my first agenda. She sets up 3 task forces: services and supports, right? Of course, every administrator. Policies and procedures, right? Culture and climate. I was like, wow, okay. Guess who headed that task force? Okay, so what has that resulted in? Well, the first thing it resulted in was that we have now, the president has put a lot, the task forces did their work. There's been tremendous change at Indiana University on all 3 of those dimensions, including being open toward thinking about some new scientific emphases on mental health. And also taking the Bring Change to Mind Club program that was only at IU, making it an institutional program and putting it on all 8 of our campuses, okay? Then, one night, I'm sort of, I'm watching TV in the middle of the night, right? Because I wake up in the middle of the night, and I see this PSA with like these 2 people. I know who this is, right? This is Jim Irsay, the owner of the Indianapolis Colts. I'm like, who the heck is that? And they're talking about kicking the stigma. And I'm thinking, okay, then I thought, okay, I didn't see it was a dream, right? About a month later, my chief of staff comes to me and says, did you see that the Indianapolis Colts? Well, what's behind this is that Brandon Marshall, who was with the, okay, is it the Bears? No. Okay, the Bears, okay. Bears, Cubs, I get confused. Okay, he's with the Bears. One day he wears lime green cleats, because he's a mental health guy, right? He wears lime green cleats, and he gets fined $10,000 by the NFL. He goes to the NFL and he says, you shouldn't be fining me for this, you should be helping me with this. They come up with this program, My Cause, My Cleats. Indianapolis Colts comes up with their philanthropic, My Cause, My Cleats is kicking the stigma. I'm like, what? So I call them and I say, do you know that we do the national stigma studies down here? And I work with them. They have a grant program. This is actually one of the 3 daughters, who will, by the way, be the first female owners of an NFL franchise when Jim retires. And she went to IU. Oh, thank you, God. But anyway, she went to IU, and I said, do you know, they have a small grants program. And I said, I've seen so much money go down a rat hole. Please let me help you. So about a year, I help her give out her money. And then she says, I said, sometime we should talk about this college program or whatever. And she says, well, we've been waiting for a proposal from you, because I'm so good at like getting donors. Like I'm so stupid after a year, I haven't even asked her for anything. And I keep saying it's a conflict of interest. It's a conflict of interest. I don't feel comfortable. So one weekend I write an 11-page proposal about how do you change stigma in a state like Indiana. And only at the end did it talk about IU. Like it was all these other things. What can you do through K through 12, et cetera? Well, she calls me up and she says, we like the last one. We now have a new institute called the Ursay Institute, named after the family, and it has a number of components of socio-medical sciences. 3 of them are mental health or addiction related. So this has been a tremendous movement for us. And so right now, we've locally expanded to all 8 campuses. We're currently coordinating with advising and joint activities through the pipeline of the 400 schools. So we now have, Indiana actually has 80 of these 400 schools. We now are piloting a middle school program, and each one of these programs is different and tailored to the level of development, right? I don't run any of those other things, I just run this. We do joint events with Kicking the Stigma. The president has asked me for a proposal to do a national rollout of You Bring Change to Mind to colleges and universities. And we're currently in discussion with the Huntsman Mental Health Institute that's doing a grand challenge on stigma, with the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and with the D9 in particular. Those are the service fraternities and sororities of mostly African American students and adults. This is a lifelong commitment as opposed to the traditional Greek system. So that's sort of where we are. Can I show this or should I skip? Should I stop? Okay, all right. Sometime you should see this. This is a student who talks about how she came to IU and then, what happened to her through her contribution.
Hello everyone, my name is Christine and I'm a junior studying biology and Russian here at IU. I'm also an aspiring doctor. If you had told me in high school that I would become a passionate advocate for mental health with a strong desire to specialize in psychiatry, I would have labeled you as misguided. But here I am to share with you my transformation and the incredible opportunities I've been afforded thanks to You Bring Change to Mind and the dedicated people behind the pilot program. As a child, one of my earliest memories were of a close relative who would lie on the couch for days on end. I never once considered that he might be sick. My family didn't talk about it. So when I came to IU, I still associated mental illness with violence and believed that those with depression should just snap out of it. However, as time went on, through my exposure to research, class projects, and other IU activities, I began to truly understand what mental illness entails. My entire attitude and perspective changed. I went from judgmental to supportive, from uneducated to understanding, but realistic as well. I've met many amazing students, faculty, and staff throughout my experience with You Bring Change to Mind. I now know that for those living with a mental illness, it is no easy feat for them to begin to share their stories. You Bring Change to Mind makes a tremendous difference in students recognizing, seeking care, and accepting that there will be times when one's mental health may be in jeopardy. To raise awareness and acceptance this year alone, we have organized a block party, run an extremely successful dinner and panel discussion regarding the TV series 13 Reasons Why, and held the 2nd annual Bring in the Booty scavenger hunt. Our events are open to everyone because everyone has something that makes them feel different or excluded at times. Through fun and trust-building events, our club has reached thousands of IU students, both with and without mental health issues. We are passionate and dedicated to changing the college climate. I know that we are at the end of our pilot study, but we are just beginning to make IU and other colleges safe and stigma-free zones. I am a living, breathing example of the good we can do and the change we can create. Together, we have started the conversation about mental illness and are reducing the stigma. With your help, I believe that we can save lives. Thank you.
I will, okay. But she was one of those students who was talked out of being a psychiatrist. She's now in the IU School of Medicine in Psychiatry. So happy to answer questions.
We don't have time on this,
okay.
So we'll need to let folks get to their
But I'll be here all day.
I'm sure that Bernice will. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry I went a little long, but it was a lot to cover, sorry. So.